Day 9, Ephesians 3, 2, 7 and 8. Prepare. There is nothing in your day that will be more important than what you are about to engage in over the next 10 minutes or so. You are going to seek hard after God, and for that to be successful, He must also be seeking you. Begin by praying the last verse in Psalm 119. I have strayed like a lost sheep. Seek your servant, for I have not forgotten your commands. Your deepest desire. Anxiety is emotional energy. One of the purposes of anxiety is to give us the energy we need to pray hard about something important. What is the most compelling anxiety in your heart today? Use that energy to cry out to God. Meditate. Ephesians 3:2. If indeed you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you. God is the source of grace, and He gives that grace to people like Paul to steward. A steward is someone in charge of doling out resources in the household. If the steward decides you get dinner, you get dinner. If he withholds it, you get nothing. Paul was a steward of God's grace. If you were alive then, and Paul decided you would get some of the grace he was in charge of, you'd get it. If he withheld it, you wouldn't. Take a moment to imagine that you were a steward in charge of dispensing portions of God's grace to people, as much as you want. What would you do? First Peter 4:10 says, just as each one has received a gift, use it to serve others as good stewards of the multifaceted grace of God. You are a steward of grace. You can distribute as much of God's grace as you want through your spiritual gifts. But if you choose to withhold it, the people at your church will have to go without that facet of God's multifaceted grace. Talk to God for a moment about what He wants you to do with the stewardship of His grace He has entrusted to you. In the verses that follow, Paul describes his ministry, the proclamation of the mystery of the gospel. Then he says this in verse 7, I became a servant of this gospel, according to the power of God's grace that was given to me by the exercise of His power. Have you ever thought of yourself as a servant of the ministry God has called you to? Usually, we think of our gifts as our servants. They serve us. But Paul thought of the work as the chief figure that Paul was to serve. What difference would that perspective make in your life? Paul was in prison when he wrote this. He couldn't observe the impact of his writing. Still, he had every confidence that his ministry was infused with divine power. Consider the implications for those times when you can't see any benefit coming from your ministry. Ask God to bless your ministry and to use it to reach many with His multifaceted grace. Most people get satisfaction from their ministry based on how much fruit they see. Missionaries report the number of conversions, the number of baptisms, how many Bibles were distributed, etc. Paul never does that. His joy and satisfaction in ministry didn't come from those things. What did it come from? Verse 8. To me, less than least of all the saints, this grace was given to proclaim to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of Christ. The fact that a man like Paul would be made a steward of God's grace astonished him, because he knew what he really deserved. Consider what you deserve and what God has given you instead, a personal task given by an act of divine power enabling you to distribute a portion of His multifaceted grace through your gifts. Talk to God about that. Pray for others, the suffering, persecuted, and lost. Think of someone you know who is suffering and pray that they would have the same joy in their suffering that Paul had in his. Joy that comes from being a steward of God's grace. Now pray the same thing for brothers and sisters around the world who are being persecuted and imprisoned for their faith. Pray with the earnestness you would have if you yourself were in chains. Pray the same thing for anyone else God has placed on your heart today. Think of someone near you who is lost. Pray that this grace would reach them. Ask the Lord to give you an opportunity today to share the gospel with someone who is lost, and that you will be ready so you don't miss the opportunity. thanksgiving. Pour out gratitude from your heart to God for the gifts and ministry you've been given and for your calling. Think of some of the blessings God has given you and relive them with an eye on God's love. Chew on them like a choice steak. Extract the flavor and take in the goodness of them until your heart swells with joy. Then express that joy to God with an I love you too expression. Take it with you. Pick one thought from this meditation that you want to carry with you. What can you use as memory cues in the upcoming day to help you bring that thought to mind at least twice more today?